Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the brutal reality of medieval winters. Picture this: the wind howls through narrow streets, snow piles up higher than your head, and the cold seems to seep into your very bones. The sun barely peeks out from behind thick clouds, and you're left to wonder how people even survived these harsh, endless winters. If you think a bad winter storm in modern times is tough, you probably won't survive the medieval version. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can imagine, with all the conveniences of modern life, it's hard to grasp how harsh things must have been when winters were a literal fight for survival. It wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about every aspect of life being altered by the weather. People living in medieval times, whether peasants or nobles, had a truly different understanding of what it meant to endure a season. Their winters weren't measured in weeks or months like ours, they were measured in survival, day to day. In fact, the idea of winter meant an entire rethinking of your daily routine. Without central heating or proper insulation, houses were cold, drafty, and uncomfortable. The simple act of staying warm involved all sorts of manual labor, from chopping wood to lighting fires that often smoked up entire homes. But even the warmth from those fires didn't guarantee comfort. The cold was so intense, so pervasive, that it reached everywhere. The very walls of your house would feel cold to the touch. Imagine living in a home with no escape from the elements, knowing that each day the freezing temperatures could threaten your life, your family, and your future. One of the biggest threats posed by these bitter winters was the fact that they shrank daylight hours to practically nothing. In the northern regions, particularly, daylight could be reduced to as little as 6 or 7 hours, leaving people with long nights filled with darkness and cold. The sun would barely rise above the horizon, casting a dim, weak light over the landscape. This constant darkness created an oppressive atmosphere. People lived under a constant cloud cover, never quite knowing if the sun would ever break through. The worst part: in some places, it wasn't just the sun that disappeared, would freeze solid, and snowstorms would make it impossible to travel. It's hard to imagine, but the roads you walk on every day, the highways you drive on, would be buried under feet of snow and ice. There was no escape. Medieval people couldn't just hop into their cars and head to warmer places. They were stuck in a frozen world that felt endless. Now, let's talk about food, because if you think surviving the cold was tough, surviving without a proper food supply was just as deadly. During medieval winters, food stores ran low, and getting fresh food became nearly impossible. Winter wasn't just a season, it was the time when survival instincts kicked into overdrive. If you didn't have enough food saved up, you weren't just hungry, you were in danger of starving. Most food was preserved in salted or pickled forms, but even those options were limited. Fresh produce was scarce, and meat had to be salted and cured, which wasn't always foolproof. There was a constant sense of uncertainty. Would there be enough food to last through the cold months, or would the family be forced to make do with whatever scraps they could find? For peasants, this could mean a constant battle with nature and the elements. For those living in cities, the struggle was no less daunting, as food would often be hoarded and prices soared during the coldest months. People would stockpile grain, meat, and vegetables, but in some winters, crops failed, and the stores ran dry. Famine could be widespread, leading to disease and death. Imagine watching your supplies dwindle as the days grew colder with no certainty that spring would ever come. And don't think for a second that these harsh winters only affected the common folk. Even the wealthiest of the medieval elite, with their castles and fortified walls, couldn't escape the fury of the cold. Castles were designed to defend, not to keep out the cold, and in some cases, they were even worse to live in than the peasant cottages. While a noble might have a better chance of surviving the winter due to his access to stored food and fuel, he still had to deal with the miserable chill. Castles, with their high stone walls and narrow windows, weren't equipped to retain heat. The stone absorbed the cold and released it throughout the day and night. Cold drafts would seep through the cracks, and with no proper insulation, the indoor temperature would often hover at freezing levels. The only real warmth came from hearth fires, which did little to stave off the frost. If the wind was especially brutal, even those inside could feel the cold creeping in from the cracks in the walls and ceiling. The danger of freezing was ever present, no matter how grand your living quarters were. What would you do in such a place? What could you possibly do to make life even remotely bearable in a time like that? Well, one answer was the hearth. Medieval people didn't just gather around the fire, they depended on it for warmth, light, and cooking. But even with the constant fire burning, it was never quite enough to ward off the bone-chilling cold that filled the air. You would spend your days huddled near the warmth, always aware that one gust of wind or failing firewood could send you back into the cold, even if you were inside. And as if that wasn't enough to deal with, the fire itself brought its own dangers. The heat could cause the wooden beams to warp or even catch fire, turning your home from a refuge to a furnace in seconds. You had to maintain it, feed it, and constantly ensure that it didn't run out, or your entire life could come crashing down. But let's be real, the cold wasn't the only thing that threatened medieval people during the winter. There were also dangers lurking in the ice and snow. Rivers would freeze over, and roads became impassable. Trade routes ground to a halt. The medieval world, for all its beauty and power, was a vast network of connected people and goods. With no cars, planes, or trains, the movement of people and goods relied on rivers and roads. But when ice trapped those pathways, life came to a standstill. You might live in a city or town, but without fresh food, supplies, and trading goods, your world shrank, and you were left to face the cold in isolation. This isolation bred fear, as the harsh weather separated families and communities. If you didn't already live near a town or village, you were basically cut off from any outside world, left to fend for yourself in the middle of an unforgiving winter landscape. Now, let's drift further into the depths of medieval winters, where the days seemed to vanish into endless nights. With no modern conveniences like streetlights or electricity, the lack of sunlight during these long, dark stretches left people living in a constant state of gloom. Imagine it. You wake up in the dark, the world outside still enshrouded in night, and you would probably only be able to make it through the day by the faintest of sunlight creeping through the thick, grey clouds. In some northern regions, the daylight hours could be as short as 6 hours, and often the sun never really seemed to show itself at all. The harshness of these long, shadowy days wasn't just physical, it was mental, too. There was an overwhelming sense of dread as winter closed in. The dark days brought depression, uncertainty, and a feeling of being trapped in an eternal cycle of cold and hunger. The cold gnawed at your bones and your spirit, slowly draining away whatever energy you had left. Some medieval folk believed that the cold came with an almost supernatural edge, making them more fearful of what winter would bring. But, of course, they had little choice but to endure, with no other option but to brace themselves against the elements. People's lives were a constant negotiation between survival and the ever-present threat of death by frostbite or disease. Historians still argue whether the lack of daylight or the cold itself was the most devastating aspect of medieval winters. But one thing is certain: the combination of darkness and cold drastically altered daily life. This wasn't just a matter of adjusting your wardrobe or finding some extra blankets. Winter required a total lifestyle change. People lived by the rhythms of the weather, planning their lives around the possibility of extreme cold and snow. They didn't just walk from room to room, they bundled up, donned layers of woolen garments, and shielded their faces from the biting winds. In fact, survival meant adjusting your entire existence to the changing seasons. Agriculture, which was the backbone of the medieval economy, practically shut down during the winter. Once the frost set in, the land was effectively frozen. There were no crops to harvest, and any food you hadn't stored for winter was now locked away by the cold. You had to rely on what you had stockpiled, and once that ran out, survival became even more tenuous. The winter months weren't just a time of limited food, they were a time of absolute isolation. The deep cold kept people inside their homes, and the roads were too treacherous to travel. Medieval villages and towns became ghostly quiet during the winter, the streets empty, and the houses sealed up tight against the cold. Food, of course, was a major concern during these winter months. It wasn't just about keeping warm, it was about making sure you didn't starve. The winter months were fraught with uncertainty about whether there would be enough food to last through the entire season. People would rely on salted meat, dried fish, and root vegetables, foods that could be preserved. But this was a risky business. If your storage wasn't sufficient, or if you didn't have enough supplies to begin with, you would go hungry. You could already be facing the cold, and the thought of running out of food only added to the growing fear. Some areas were lucky enough to have grain stores, but many of the poorest peasants would have little more than what they could scrounge together or trade for. If things got really bad, there was no guarantee of a fair distribution of resources, and the richest landowners would often hoard supplies. That's when desperation set in. People didn't just worry about the cold, they worried about whether they would even make it to the end of the season with enough food to survive. Famine wasn't just a distant worry, it was a real, daily threat. The harsh winters only added to the struggles of medieval life, where the basic human need for food and warmth was an ongoing battle. The threat of death, of course, was never far behind. Cold temperatures could take a deadly toll, especially if people weren't able to stay warm. It's not like today, where you can just step into a warm home, put on a pair of heated socks, and light up the fireplace. No, medieval people didn't have such luxuries. When they faced extreme cold, it often meant getting frostbite or hypothermia. Frostbite in medieval times could lead to amputations, or worse, gangrene, which could spread to the bloodstream, eventually leading to death. But even if you avoided the worst of the cold, there were other threats lurking in those long, miserable winters. The human body is an incredible thing, but it's no match for extended exposure to freezing conditions without the proper resources. People might have their fires burning, but they couldn't escape the chill that seeped into their bones. But cold wasn't the only thing that made medieval winters so dangerous. Winter was the breeding ground for diseases, especially for the most vulnerable in society. Poor sanitation, combined with the heavy use of stored food, meant that diseases spread easily. Outbreaks of the plague, typhus, and dysentery became even more deadly when combined with freezing temperatures. The cold weather kept people inside, making it easier for sickness to spread rapidly through homes and villages. The weakened bodies of the sick were less able to fight off the infections, making them more vulnerable. A simple cold could turn into a deadly illness in the winter months. People didn't just face the cold, they faced an ever-present threat of disease that they had little power to fight. Communities were often struck by death, and entire families could be wiped out by a single infection. In many ways, medieval winters were a time of reflection, a time when the vulnerability of human life was most apparent. People couldn't escape the cold, and they couldn't escape the constant worry that death might be just around the corner. There was little room for optimism. Even the strongest and wealthiest couldn't avoid the harshness of winter. Whether they were high-born nobles in cold, drafty castles or peasants living in huts made of mud and straw, everyone had to face the bitter reality of winter. There was no escape from the cold, no way to control the elements that governed their lives, and the fear of starvation, disease, and the unknown was a constant companion. Historians still debate whether medieval society could have prepared better for these hardships. Did people have any real understanding of the dangers they faced? Or were they simply at the mercy of the natural world, doing their best to endure whatever came their way? One thing is clear. Medieval winters weren't just a time of cold, they were a time of constant struggle and fear. If you made it through the winter, it was because you fought to survive. And it wasn't just physical survival, it was mental too. The mental strain of facing such an unrelenting season, year after year, was enough to wear down even the strongest. The winters were a reminder of how fragile life really is, and how, even in the harshest of times, the will to survive still burns within us. Asterisk. Let's now turn our attention to one of the most terrifying elements of medieval winters, the risk of frozen famine. If you think food scarcity is a problem only seen in modern times, then prepare to be surprised. For medieval people, the fear of hunger wasn't just a seasonal concern, it was an ongoing battle. When winter struck, the cold didn't just freeze your body, it froze your means of survival. The impact on food production was devastating. Agriculture simply didn't work in winter. With the earth locked under frost, farming and harvesting were impossible. The only way to make it through the season was to rely on stores of food you'd accumulated in the warmer months. But that's where the real problem lay. If you didn't stockpile enough food, or if your stored food wasn't preserved properly, you risked starving. When winter stretched on too long, supplies dwindled and desperation set in. The lucky few who lived near large towns or villages with access to more abundant food might have had a chance, but for rural peasants, survival was a constant worry. Historians still argue whether winter scarcity was the leading cause of famine during medieval times, or whether it was a consequence of poor planning and poor management. Regardless, one thing was clear. If you didn't have enough food to see you through the winter, it was a grim prospect. Let's not forget about the food preservation techniques used back then. Salted meat, dried fish, and pickled vegetables were the staples of any medieval pantry. But these methods weren't foolproof. A wrong turn in the preservation process could lead to rot. And if you found yourself with spoiled food during the harshest part of winter, you were in real trouble. It wasn't just that you couldn't get fresh food, it was that you had to make do with what was available. And sometimes that meant eating food that was far from ideal. Some people had access to root vegetables, which were somewhat resilient against the cold, but not everyone had enough space to grow or store them properly. The rest of the world felt the pressure of the winter months. But in medieval times, those pressures could become life-threatening. Some people even resorted to extreme measures in their desperation. There are records of individuals turning to cannibalism when the food stores ran dry. In some of the most extreme cases, it wasn't just starvation that led to death. It was the mental toll that the unrelenting cold and hunger took on people's spirits. With so many risks surrounding food, medieval people had to be incredibly resourceful to survive. One of their key strategies was to rely on the animals they kept. Domesticated animals like pigs, cows, and chickens were invaluable, and the meat and other products they provided kept families alive during the cold months. But here's the thing. If the winter was particularly harsh, you couldn't just rely on what your animals produced. You had to slaughter them at the right time, before the cold weather made it impossible to feed them, or when resources became too scarce to maintain them. However, even this wasn't always a foolproof plan. If the animals died due to cold or disease, you were left with nothing. That constant balancing act of feeding your livestock, protecting them from the cold, and ensuring they were ready for slaughter when the time came was no small task. So, in many ways, medieval winters were a test of not just physical endurance, but mental fortitude. Every decision you made about food, what to store, what to preserve, what to slaughter could mean the difference between life and death. While food scarcity was a terrifying possibility during the winter, another major issue came with the freezing rivers and roads. Picture yourself standing on a vast frozen river. You've heard stories of travelers using these ice-covered paths to get from one town to another, but the risks are real. On one hand, frozen rivers meant that the vital trade routes could still function despite the snow. Traders could cross previously impassable bodies of water, bringing much-needed goods to towns and villages. But on the other hand, a frozen river was as much a trap as a path to safety. The ice could crack, and if you didn't know where to cross, or if the weather changed suddenly, you could be swept away in an instant. The cold turned rivers into life-threatening obstacles. Even walking down the frozen road could be deadly. Snowstorms would bury the roads under feet of snow, making it impossible to travel. Entire towns could be cut off from the outside world for weeks. Travel became treacherous, and even basic supply runs for food or firewood turned into life or death missions. The freezing roads weren't just an inconvenience, they were a constant source of danger. And it wasn't just rivers and roads that suffered from the ice, everything did. Imagine the town square, usually bustling with life, now covered in a thick blanket of snow and ice. The market stalls that once supplied you with fresh food and supplies are now completely cut off. The surrounding forests, once full of trees that could provide wood for fires, are now nearly impossible to navigate due to the deep snow. The world shrinks, and your house, your shelter, becomes your entire world. If you didn't have enough firewood, you couldn't even keep warm. And if you didn't have the right tools, you couldn't even venture out to gather more. The weight of the cold seemed to press in on every aspect of life. For people who lived near larger cities or towns, the risk of travel was a constant worry. Imagine the stress that came with sending someone on a simple errand, knowing that their journey could end in disaster. It wasn't just about getting from one place to another, it was about surviving the journey. Now, we can't talk about medieval winters without acknowledging the fortresses. castles, and manor houses that served as homes to the elite. You might think that these grand structures, with their thick stone walls and towering turrets, would be impervious to the cold. After all, these buildings were meant to withstand attacks, right? But here's the kicker: castles were not built for warmth. While they could defend against invaders, they couldn't defend against the winter. Inside those cold stone walls, there were no modern heating systems, and most castles only had fireplaces to provide warmth. Those fireplaces, though large, didn't have the efficiency needed to truly warm such a vast stone structure. Even the wealthiest people found themselves huddling together by the fire, layering themselves in blankets, and still enduring the harsh chill of the cold air. Imagine spending your days in one of these drafty castles, looking out from the high walls to the snowy countryside, and realizing there was no escape from the bitter cold. Let's shift gears a little now and take a closer look at the effects of the brutal medieval winters on health. If you thought the cold just made life uncomfortable, think again. During these harsh times, the cold weather was a deadly force that had serious impacts on people's health. Medieval winters weren't just about enduring the weather, they were about surviving the diseases and health problems that were exacerbated by the freezing temperatures. Hypothermia was a constant threat. If you were caught outside for too long without proper clothing, your body temperature would drop dangerously low, and the consequences were dire. Even those who stayed indoors could be at risk of frostbite, especially if they had to venture out into the snow to fetch firewood or food. Frostbite, which results in the freezing and damaging of skin and tissue, was a common affliction in the harsh winters, but that wasn't the worst of it. As the weather turned colder, the body's immune system became weaker, making people more susceptible to disease. Historians still debate the exact relationship between winter and disease, but one thing is for sure: the long, cold months were a breeding ground for illness. With homes packed full of people trying to stay warm around fires, diseases could spread like wildfire. The close proximity of people, coupled with poor sanitation and lack of medical knowledge, meant that outbreaks of the plague, influenza, and other diseases were a constant threat. What's more, once the illnesses took hold, there were few remedies to turn to. Without antibiotics, vaccines, or even basic medical care, people's chances of surviving these winter outbreaks were slim. Even with these health risks, medieval people had no real way of escaping the cold. There were no heated homes or modern medical facilities to protect them. Instead, survival meant constant vigilance, relying on what little knowledge they had about the cold and how to prevent illness. The best way to prevent hypothermia or frostbite was to keep moving, but that wasn't always an option. If you were stuck in a small house with your family, waiting for the storm to pass, you couldn't just step outside and take a walk. People would bundle up in layers of clothing, woolen tunics, cloaks, and hats, and they'd gather around the fire for warmth. But the fire wasn't always enough to stave off the cold, and even the warmest clothing couldn't protect you from the brutal wind that cut through everything. Keeping warm meant staying as close to the fire as possible, and even then, the cold could still seep into the body, leaving you chilled to the bone. While health problems were common during these harsh winters, another major challenge people faced was the lack of light. With daylight hours so short, and the sun only peaking above the horizon for a few hours at best, people had to make do with the little light they had. This meant that most people would be forced to stay indoors for much of the day, and when they weren't trying to stay warm by the fire, they were often trying to occupy their time in ways that didn't require much energy. Without the modern luxuries of television, internet, or even books. People would spend the dark hours talking, weaving, or engaging in other quiet tasks. The lack of sunlight had a profound impact on the people's mental state. Imagine not seeing the sun for days or even weeks at a time. It wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a psychological one too. Darkness and isolation created an atmosphere of unease, and people would often grow more anxious. As the world outside became more unpredictable and unforgiving, for those who were wealthy enough to live in castles, there were some ways to manage the lack of light. Castles often had large windows, though they were often small and poorly insulated. The light that streamed in was minimal, so these spaces would be kept dimly lit with candles and torches. But even the richest families couldn't escape the reality of short, dark days. At night, the cold would creep in, and the air inside would grow stale. There was only so much that a few fires and some light could do to alleviate the heavy toll. The winter took. Castles weren't warm or cozy places, no matter how much wealth was invested in them. They were designed for defense, not comfort. The layout, with thick stone walls, would trap the cold inside. The only real way to stay warm was to huddle together by the fire, an experience that was less comforting and more of a necessity. Now, imagine the most vulnerable in society, the poor peasants living in simple huts or even out in the open. For them, winters were especially brutal. With no grand hearths or stone walls to protect them, they had to rely on whatever shelter they could build from wood and straw. These huts, while providing some protection from the wind and snow, were nowhere near sufficient to keep out the cold. A simple thatched roof might protect them from rain, but it didn't do much against the frost. The floors of these huts were often nothing more than dirt, and they had little in the way of furnishings to help keep them comfortable. The poor had no choice but to huddle together under blankets, as close to the fire as possible, but even that was a risky proposition. Firewood had to be rationed, and when the fuel ran out, people were left with nothing but the cold. Despite these harsh realities, medieval people developed ways to endure. They had to. There was no choice but to survive. One of the primary methods they used to cope with the cold was layering their clothing. Multiple layers of woolen tunics, cloaks, and hats helped trap body heat and protect against the elements. Even the poorest people had to learn how to use whatever resources they could find to make clothing that would help them survive. Animal skins were often used for warmth, particularly in northern regions where the cold was more intense. Furs from animals like deer and rabbits provided additional insulation, but they weren't available to everyone. For those living near forests, wood was a valuable resource, and it could be used to heat their homes and cook food. But even with these techniques, survival was never guaranteed. The cold still found ways to creep in, and no matter how prepared you were, there was always the looming threat of starvation, illness, or freezing to death. But let's not forget about the amazing resilience of people during these times. Despite the constant battles with the elements, medieval people managed to survive, often through sheer force of will. Communities came together to support one another, sharing what little they had, working together to gather food, build shelters, and tend to the sick. It was a brutal existence, but one that relied heavily on the strength of community. And in a world where everything seemed stacked against them, people still managed to find ways to carry on. Asterisk. Let's now take a look at the unique role winter festivals played during the brutal medieval winters. You may think that when the cold sets in, life becomes nothing but a struggle for survival, and in many ways, it certainly did. However, even in the darkest of seasons, there were moments of respite. The winter months, filled with hunger, illness, and isolation, often felt endless. But every so often, the medieval world would break free from the oppression of the cold with festivals and celebrations. These moments of joy were not just about merrymaking, they were essential for mental health and community spirit. After all, with months of darkness ahead, these festivals were some of the only ways people could break the monotony and try to lift their spirits. The most famous of these winter festivals was, of course, Christmas, which was celebrated by both the church and the common folk alike. But beyond Christmas, there were a variety of other events, feasts, and days of indulgence that allowed people to momentarily forget the hardships of winter. Historians argue whether medieval people truly found joy in these festivals, or whether they were more a matter of necessity, a way to stave off despair. Some even argue that these celebrations were a form of rebellion against the suffocating grip of the cold, a way to assert one's humanity even in the face of overwhelming adversity. After all, what else could you do when the days stretched on dark and cold? Some of the most significant winter festivals involved the consumption of special foods that were typically unavailable in the harsh winter months. Feasts of meats, roasted game, and fish were common, and for many, it was one of the few times in the year they would be able to enjoy such rich fare. Even though the food was often salted and preserved, it was still a rare treat, something to look forward to during the otherwise lean months. The food wasn't the only highlight though. Music, dancing, and theatrical performances brought much-needed joy to the dreary medieval towns and villages. In some regions, people celebrated the winter solstice, marking the point when the days would finally begin to lengthen again, offering a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But there were also less cheerful sides to these winter festivals, particularly when it came to the role that superstition played in the medieval mind. In the harsh, dark winter months, people clung to old beliefs about spirits, ghosts, and the supernatural. These winter festivals often had elements of ritual that were intended to ward off evil spirits or protect people from the unknown dangers that winter brought with it. During these festivals, people would often engage in specific activities that they believed would ensure good fortune in the year ahead. Sometimes, there would be symbolic sacrifices, where food or even livestock would be offered as gifts to the gods or spirits, hoping to ensure the survival of the community through the coming months. It wasn't just about celebrating winter. Festivals were about survival, protection, and warding off the deathly cold that seemed to permeate everything. Yet, despite the joy and comfort that these festivals might bring, the harshness of the winter season could not be entirely forgotten. One of the greatest dangers of the medieval winter was the increasing isolation. As snow piled up and roads became impassable, villages and towns were cut off from each other. For the wealthy, this meant fewer opportunities to travel to distant regions. But for the poor, it often meant a total lack of outside help. If you were a peasant living in a remote village, cut off by snow and ice, you were utterly dependent on whatever you could gather from your immediate surroundings. The festive mood of the holidays might have lifted some spirits, but that didn't change the fact that isolation in winter was dangerous. People had to rely on their ingenuity to survive, and many times, they didn't have enough resources to last the entire winter. There are even records of entire villages disappearing during particularly brutal winters, either from starvation or disease, brought on by the extreme conditions. Surviving winter in medieval times was a full-time job, and it wasn't something you could take for granted. From the wealthy in their castles to the poorest in their humble cottages, everyone had to learn how to endure. Medieval castles were designed to be imposing and defensible, but they were hardly built to be warm. The thick stone walls that protected them from invaders did little to keep out the cold, and even the grandest halls were left to feel the chill of winter. The hearths were central to survival, but the warmth they provided didn't stretch far. In some cases, people would have to huddle around a fire for warmth, sharing what little comfort they had. Those living in castles and manor houses might have had more wealth and access to supplies, but they, too, faced a threat of the cold. For the common folk, however, the situation was even more dire. Their homes, constructed from mud and thatch, offered little protection against the bitter winds and snow. Many people lived in a constant state of cold, shivering through the long winter nights. Even the simplest comfort was difficult to come by, as firewood was precious, and once the supply ran low, there was little to do but endure. It's hard to imagine just how difficult life must have been, knowing that survival depended on managing resources, avoiding illness, and surviving the elements. Medieval people didn't just sit idly by and wait for winter to pass, though. They found ways to adapt to the cold, even if it was an exhausting, daily battle. Layered clothing was a necessity, and it wasn't just about wearing thick woolen tunics. People wore multiple layers of clothing, often including animal skins, and fur to trap in heat. The poor would sometimes resort to wearing whatever they could find, using sacks or even hides from animals to protect themselves. Footwear, too, was crucial during these cold months. If you didn't have proper shoes or boots, the cold could easily freeze your toes, and frostbite was a constant threat. For those who could afford it, leather boots lined with fur or wool helped protect against the freezing ground. But no matter how well you prepared, the cold could still find its way in. It wasn't just about clothing. It was about the mental fortitude to endure day after day of constant cold, hunger, and isolation. The bitter reality of medieval winters paints a picture of a time when survival was anything but guaranteed. Every winter was a gamble, and for many, it was a life or death struggle. From the frozen rivers to the poor health conditions, the challenges of these harsh winters were ever present, and the lives of the people living through them were shaped by their ability to endure. Medieval winters weren't just about braving the elements, they were about confronting the very essence of human frailty. Whether in their castles or cottages, medieval people had to summon every ounce of strength to survive another day, knowing that tomorrow might be even colder, even harsher than today. As we continue our journey through the frosty labyrinth of medieval winters, we encounter one of the most formidable elements that plagued the northern parts of Europe during this time: the iron-fisted winter of the north. In regions like Scandinavia, the severity of the cold reached almost mythical proportions, transforming life into an unrelenting battle against the elements. The winters here weren't just a season, they were a force of nature, so overwhelming that people's entire existence was shaped by the brutal cold. Imagine standing in the middle of a frozen landscape, where the wind cuts through you like a knife and the horizon is obscured by endless snow. The trees are bare, their branches heavy with frost, and the sun, if it appears at all, offers nothing more than a brief and feeble presence before vanishing behind thick clouds once again. Here, survival meant adapting to the cold in ways that would seem almost unimaginable today. For the people of the north, particularly in Scandinavia, every winter felt like a test of endurance, a time when even the strongest could be broken by the relentless conditions. Unlike in more temperate areas where the cold was bearable, the northern regions were forced to confront a chilling reality where every aspect of life was impacted by the frigid temperatures. Historians still debate the full extent of how the cold affected daily life in these regions. Some suggest that life was marginally easier in coastal areas, where the proximity to the sea provided some buffer against the cold, while others argue that no part of Scandinavia was safe from the crushing grip of winter. However, what is agreed upon is that the winters in the north were long, cold, and merciless. The people here faced days when the sun never rose above the horizon, leaving them in complete darkness for weeks on end. These extended periods of darkness were not just a physical challenge, they were a psychological one. With little daylight, people had to rely on their resourcefulness to maintain their sense of time and order. Much of daily life took place in the dim light of flickering candles, and the absence of sunlight meant that the rhythms of the seasons were hard to follow. This loss of natural light led to feelings of isolation, depression, and despair, which were worsened by the cold. People stayed indoors for long stretches, their lives dictated by the weather and the fight for survival. Outside, the elements were brutal, and the work needed to keep homes warm, fed, and functional never stopped. The necessity of heating, of course, became a major focus of survival. The hearth was the center of medieval Scandinavian homes, just as it was in other parts of Europe. But the efficiency of these fires was limited by the designs of the homes themselves. Scandinavian dwellings were often constructed from wood or stone with minimal insulation, leaving gaps for cold air to seep through the walls. People would build their homes close together, relying on communal living to share warmth. Those who lived in the countryside were even more vulnerable, as their isolated locations made it difficult to access help or resources. Without easy access to firewood, the cold could quickly overtake them. If the fire went out, survival was put in jeopardy. The constant need for fuel and the difficulty of gathering it in the frozen landscape created an ongoing struggle that forced people to plan months in advance. Sometimes, entire villages would face shortages, and families would be forced to ration their fuel, stretching out their wood supplies until the thaw came in spring. This struggle for warmth was more than just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of life and death. People had to constantly make sure that their fires were kept alive, and in the worst winters, there were often desperate measures to ensure that there was enough fuel to survive. But let's not forget the dangers that went beyond the cold and isolation. The winter months brought with them an increased risk of disease, and the frigid temperatures made it more difficult for the sick to recover. The bodies of those weakened by illness were more susceptible to the cold, and even simple colds could quickly escalate into life-threatening conditions like pneumonia. In rural communities, there were no doctors to turn to, no modern medicine to alleviate suffering. People had to rely on old herbal remedies and the knowledge passed down through generations to treat their ailments. But in many cases, these remedies were inadequate in the face of the severe cold. The constant exposure to freezing temperatures also led to chronic health problems, such as frostbite and trench foot. Many people lost fingers, toes, and limbs to the cold. And if the frostbite wasn't treated, it could lead to gangrene and death. Even those who survived the harsh winter months sometimes had to live with the long-term consequences of frostbite and other cold-related injuries, which could cripple them for the rest of their lives. Another fascinating element of Scandinavian winters was the role that mythology and folklore played in helping people cope with the harsh environment. When the world outside felt unkind and dangerous, people turned to stories of gods, spirits, and otherworldly creatures to explain the forces of nature. In Nordic folklore, Winter was often depicted as a time when the realms of the living and the dead could merge. Spirits and gods, like the Norse god of winter, Allher, were believed to have control over the cold, and stories about these deities offered people comfort. The long nights were filled with tales of monstrous beings, like trolls and spirits, who lived in the darkness. These creatures were both feared and revered, representing the forces of nature that no one could control. For medieval people in Scandinavia, winter wasn't just a season, it was a living, breathing entity, full of stories, danger, and mystery. The myths surrounding winter were a way for people to make sense of the chaos around them. In a time when so much was unpredictable, these stories provided meaning and gave people something to hold on to when the cold was unbearable. But despite the danger, despite the cold, the northern peoples of medieval Europe endured. They adapted to the harsh conditions by crafting tools and techniques that would help them survive the long winters. They learned to make clothing from animal hides, fur, and wool to keep themselves warm. Their homes were built to trap heat, with thatched roofs and small, carefully constructed doors and windows. They learned how to hunt and fish even in the bitterest of temperatures, and how to preserve food through salting and drying so they could make it through the lean months. Their resilience, ingenuity, and determination kept them alive in the face of extreme adversity. It was a way of life that required constant vigilance, but it also fostered a deep connection to the land and the environment. The cold may have been relentless, but it was the will to survive, the power of community, and the strength of the human spirit that helped them endure. In the end, the iron-fisted winter of the North was just one chapter in the story of medieval winters. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, and the danger were all part of a harsh but necessary reality that people lived through. But despite all the hardships, they survived, proving that, even in the most extreme conditions, humans have the ability to adapt and persevere. And while the cold may have tested their strength, it also showed them what they were capable of when they faced the unrelenting winter together. As we continue through the icy grip of medieval winters, let's delve into another pressing issue that affected the lives of many: the impact of these harsh seasons on health. For those living through these extended periods of cold, survival wasn't just a matter of keeping warm or finding food. It was about maintaining one's health in the face of freezing temperatures, diseases, and limited resources. The cold weather didn't just make life uncomfortable, it exposed people to a host of dangers that were often life-threatening. In the Middle Ages, when medical knowledge was primitive, dealing with the consequences of exposure to harsh winters could be a matter of life or death. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval winters directly caused the outbreaks of diseases like the plague. But one thing is certain: the combination of freezing temperatures, poor sanitation, and overcrowded living conditions made winters a breeding ground for illness. The lack of modern medicine meant that even the simplest cold could turn fatal when coupled with the extreme cold. Pneumonia, frostbite, and hypothermia were not just risks, they were very real threats that many people had to face every winter. Hypothermia, which occurs when the body's core temperature drops below normal levels, was particularly dangerous during medieval winters. In an age without heated homes or modern clothing, it didn't take long for someone exposed to the cold to become severely chilled. The cold could quickly overwhelm the body, leading to numbness, confusion, and a loss of coordination. People who ventured out into the bitter cold without proper protection were particularly vulnerable. Once hypothermia set in, there was little anyone could do to save the person if they couldn't get them to shelter in time. The freezing temperatures could cause blood vessels to constrict, leading to a lack of circulation in the extremities, which resulted in frostbite. Fingers, toes, and even entire limbs could be lost to the frost. Once the damage was done, there was no way to reverse it, and for many, this led to permanent disability or even death. Medieval people often lived in tight quarters, huddling together for warmth, but the cold still found its way in. The constant exposure to these frigid temperatures took a toll on the body's ability to ward off illness. When the immune system was already weakened by the cold, diseases spread more easily. On top of that, the threat of disease during the winter months loomed large. In the absence of modern sanitation and medicine, diseases like the plague, typhus, and dysentery could spread rapidly in the close quarters of medieval villages and towns. The winter months provided the perfect conditions for these diseases to thrive. Poor hygiene, inadequate nutrition, and the overcrowded conditions of medieval homes all contributed to the spread of illness. People living in such tight spaces, often in poorly ventilated homes, would breathe in the same air for hours on end, increasing the chances of respiratory infections, with the cold making it difficult for people to stay outdoors or even move around. These illnesses could easily spread from one person to the next, particularly when the sick were confined to small, warm spaces. Once these illnesses spread through a family or village, there was often little that could be done to stop them. With no antibiotics, vaccines, or even basic medical care, medieval people had to rely on herbal remedies and folk medicine to treat illnesses, but these treatments were often ineffective. In some cases, people would turn to more superstitious practices, hoping to ward off disease with charms, incantations, or rituals. While these might have provided some comfort, they were no match for the diseases that thrived in the harsh winter conditions. Even though medieval people had some knowledge of how to cope with illness, their understanding of disease was limited. The winter months, with their long periods of darkness and bitter cold, were a time when disease could take hold quickly, and the mortality rates were higher than during the warmer months. In some of the worst winters, entire families or villages could be wiped out by the plague or other diseases, leaving survivors to pick up the pieces of a shattered community. Medieval winters weren't just hard on the body, they were hard on the soul, too. The cold, isolation, and disease made every season feel like a battle, and the loss of loved ones could leave emotional scars that lasted a lifetime. Despite these challenges, medieval people didn't just succumb to the cold and disease, they fought back, using whatever resources they had at their disposal to survive. One of the key survival strategies was the use of clothing. People would wear layers upon layers of woolen tunics, cloaks, and furs to keep themselves warm. These layers helped trap heat close to the body, but they weren't always enough to protect against the extreme cold. People living in rural areas, where resources were scarcer, would often rely on animal hides and fur to make their clothing more durable and insulating. In addition to clothing, people would use any available materials to insulate their homes. Mud, straw, and animal dung were often used to fill cracks in walls, and roofs were covered with thatch or other materials that could help retain warmth. This was a matter of necessity, as the cold could easily infiltrate homes that weren't properly sealed. For those living in castles or manor houses, the challenge was still present. The thick stone walls that protected these buildings from invaders did little to stop the cold from creeping inside. Even the wealthiest families had to endure the discomfort of cold, drafty rooms, and the best they could do was gather around the fire for warmth. But what about the people who lived far from the cities, in the wilderness, where the elements were even more unforgiving. These isolated communities had to rely on their resourcefulness to survive. They would hunt, fish, and gather whatever food they could find. In the harshest winters, they might even resort to extreme measures, like foraging for tree bark or eating whatever scraps they could find. The cold would take its toll on them, and often their health would suffer. But it was the strength of community that helped these people endure. Neighbors would band together, helping each other gather firewood, share food, and care for the sick. In this way, survival became not just a personal challenge, but a communal one. Even though the winter was a time of hardship, it also fostered a sense of solidarity and cooperation. Still, the battle against the elements wasn't over once. The worst of the cold had passed. The thaw brought with it new challenges. As the snow melted and rivers swelled, the risk of flooding increased. Even after the cold had broken, medieval people faced the ongoing dangers of disease and famine. The winter might have ended, but the scars left by the cold were still felt long after the thaw. Every season presented a new set of challenges. But medieval winters were particularly harsh. They tested the limits of human endurance and left their mark on history. As the season progresses, another deeply significant feature of medieval winters emerges: the survival of the castles themselves. For those who lived in them, the thick stone walls might have been meant to protect them from invaders, but they also proved to be formidable barriers against the heat, trapping the cold air inside and making the interiors of castles unbearably chilly. Imagine being a noble in a grand stone castle, the hearth at the center of the great hall, barely able to keep the freezing wind at bay. You might expect that castles built with thick stone walls to protect against outside threats would be warm and secure refuges during the brutal cold of winter. However, despite their imposing exteriors and tall towers, medieval castles were often little more than cold, damp fortresses during the winter months. The thick stone, while great for withstanding attacks, had no insulation against the cold. In fact, the cold stone walls absorbed the chill, and even when the hearths roared with a fire, the heat failed to travel very far. The living spaces remained icy, and the high ceilings made it difficult for heat to reach the floors, leaving the lower areas frigid and uncomfortable. Those who lived in castles had to endure a lifestyle that was no less harsh than the common folk who lived in simpler homes. Yes, they had better food supplies and greater access to warmth, but the castles themselves were often as cold and uncomfortable as any peasant's hut. Some of the wealthiest families might have had an easier time surviving the winter. With their ability to store food and access higher quality clothing, but even they were vulnerable to the dangers of the cold. The common solution to this problem was to huddle together by the fire, which was often located in the main hall or great room of the castle. For many, the hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and a place for families to gather during the long, dark nights. The fire was the central point around which all daily activities revolved: cooking, eating, and socializing. However, the reliance on the hearth came with its own set of risks. While the fire provided heat, it also presented the danger of smoke, which could fill the room and make the air difficult to breathe. In castles, where multiple families or servants lived in the same space, the constant smoke from the hearth could cause respiratory issues, making life even more uncomfortable during the long winter. To combat this, castle dwellers often used chimneys and flues, but these were often poorly designed, allowing smoke to linger in the room. As the fire crackled and burned, the people gathered around it, huddling together for warmth. But while the fire provided temporary relief, it did little to address the underlying cold that persisted in the rest of the castle. With no modern insulation or heating systems, castles remained a cold and uncomfortable place to live. Even wealthy nobles couldn't escape the chill. To make matters worse, the cold also brought with it the constant risk of disease. The damp, drafty environment of the castle, coupled with the close quarters of the people living there, created the perfect breeding ground for illness. Coughs and colds, the flu, and even the plague would make their way into the castle walls, taking advantage of the weakened immune systems of those living there at the same time. In the villages and towns surrounding the castles, life wasn't much easier. The harshness of winter affected everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the wealthiest noble. The poorer people, who often lived in small, poorly built homes made from wood or mud, had to rely on whatever materials they could find to protect themselves from the cold. These homes offered little protection against the elements, and without proper insulation, the cold seeped into every corner. For the poorest people, survival during the winter was an everyday struggle. Food had to be carefully rationed, and the simple act of lighting a fire could mean the difference between life and death. Without enough firewood, many people simply froze. The people living in these conditions had to make do with whatever resources they could scrounge, often relying on their ingenuity to stay alive. The poorest people might have had no more than a single room in their homes, shared by the whole family and often by animals as well. The smoke from the hearth would fill the room, adding to the discomfort of the cold, and with no escape from the bitter chill. The struggle for warmth was constant. The cold also had a profound impact on the animals that people depended on for food, clothing, and transport. During medieval winters, animals such as horses, cows, and sheep would often struggle to survive the extreme conditions. While some animals were well suited to the cold, others were less resilient. In particularly harsh winters, it wasn't uncommon for entire herds to perish from the cold or lack of food. People depended on their animals for meat, milk, and wool, and losing these resources could be devastating. Farmers and herders would often be forced to slaughter their animals before the cold took them, ensuring that the meat was preserved for the winter. But in times of extreme cold, even that wasn't enough. The fear of losing their livestock added another layer of stress for those living through the winter months. What's even more fascinating is how these brutal winters affected the course of history. Some historians argue that the medieval period's harsh winters played a role in shaping the political and social landscape of Europe. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that began in the 14th century, brought even colder winters to Europe, causing crop failures, food shortages, and famine. This, in turn, led to widespread unrest and even political upheaval. Some scholars suggest that the economic and social disruptions caused by these cold years contributed to the downfall of entire kingdoms and the weakening of monarchies. As resources became scarcer and people became more desperate, societies found themselves in turmoil. However, the same cold that disrupted society also spurred innovation. People began to develop better ways of preserving food, creating more efficient heating methods, and even improving their clothing to adapt to the cold. This drive to survive in the face of the relentless winter gave birth to new technologies and techniques that would eventually lead to the development of the modern world. While the cold might have made life in medieval times harsh, it also forced humanity to innovate, adapt, and collaborate in ways that would shape future generations. The survival of the castles, the villagers, and the people themselves speaks to the resilience and ingenuity of medieval society. Even in the face of bitter cold, the human spirit endured, finding ways to thrive despite the freezing temperatures and harsh winters. The medieval winter, with all its dangers and difficulties, became a defining feature of life during this time. It shaped the culture, politics, and society in ways that continue to influence us today. As we move further into the chilling world of medieval winters, let's take a step into the forests and villages, where the struggle for survival wasn't just about enduring the cold, was about navigating the dangers that the snow and ice brought with them. For medieval people, the winter months were a time when every walk outside could lead to disaster. The roads, already treacherous due to poor maintenance, became nearly impassable under thick blankets of snow. As the snow piled up, so too did the risk of getting stuck. Travel, particularly for merchants, became an exercise in patience and caution. Rivers, which were once bustling with trade and travel, would freeze solid, turning vital transportation routes into nothing more than icy, dangerous wastelands. While the freezing rivers did provide an opportunity for travel across landlocked areas, this came at a great cost. The ice could be unpredictable. At any moment, what seemed like a solid, safe crossing could give way, plunging anyone who dared to venture onto it into frigid waters. The threat of breaking through the ice and drowning was ever present, and with few modern tools to test its strength, people had no choice but to take their chances. However, there were those who had no choice but to continue with their work, risking life and limb to deliver goods, maintain food supplies, or ensure that daily needs were met. The threat of icy roads and rivers was not confined to just the wealthy. Merchants or travelers, even the villagers, had to contend with these conditions. Imagine being a peasant who already has so little and having to deal with a landscape that seems intent on making survival even harder. These poor souls couldn't simply wait for the thaw. They had to keep their farms running, their families fed, and their homes heated. But with the snow and ice piling up, their efforts were frequently stymied. Roads were blocked, trapping people in their villages, and snowdrifts made hunting and foraging for food a far more dangerous activity. Foraging for firewood or hunting game could become life-threatening pursuits, as hunters and gatherers had to contend with the elements, often venturing into harsh forests where wolves or other predators lurked, waiting to pounce the poor wood. Be forced to rely on whatever they could scrounge from the land around them. If they weren't careful, they risked going hungry, or worse, freezing to death if they became lost in the wilderness. But it wasn't just the cold that posed a threat. As much as the winter months were defined by the overwhelming chill, they were also a time when the land itself seemed to shift into something unrecognizable. The forests, which were once lush and teeming with life, became foreboding places, their trees stripped of leaves and branches. The bare skeletal trees, weighed down by snow, created an eerie, haunting landscape that mirrored the isolation that medieval people felt during these long, dark winters. For those who had to venture out, the forests could be both a source of sustenance and danger, while there was still the chance to gather firewood, hunt for game, or trap animals for food. The vast snow-covered expanse of the forest could also turn deadly. The long nights brought predators like wolves and bears out of their dens, desperate to find food. For the medieval person, venturing into the woods during the winter wasn't just a necessary task, it was an act of courage and will. But even if you managed to avoid the wolves and the other predators, the forest still posed a challenge in the form of deep snow, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of getting lost. The idea of getting lost was a real concern in medieval times. With no modern navigational tools, People had to rely on their knowledge of the land, the stars, and landmarks to guide them. But in the winter, these landmarks were often obscured by snow and ice, leaving travelers and villagers to navigate in near-complete darkness. The lack of visibility and the disorienting quality of a snow-covered landscape could cause even the most experienced wanderer to lose their way. If you wandered too far, it could mean certain death. Once the snow began to fall, it would accumulate quickly, burying any footprints that might have served as a guide. The cold would sap a person's strength, and if you became lost, it wasn't just the elements you had to fear, it was the lack of shelter, food, and warmth that would soon lead to your demise. It was a terrifying reality for those who had to venture into the wilderness. Even those who lived in towns and villages weren't immune to this danger. The simple act of walking to a neighboring village for supplies could turn into an odyssey, fraught with risk and peril. The weather was a constant enemy. But what made it even more challenging for medieval people was that they had no true knowledge of what was happening in the wider world. Without modern science or meteorology, there was no way to predict how bad the winter would be, or how long it would last. Every year, people had to face the unknown. The unpredictability of the seasons added an extra layer of tension to medieval winters. While some winters might have been mild, others could be catastrophic, causing entire villages to collapse under the weight of famine or disease. There were records of particularly harsh winters, such as the famous Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when the cold combined with crop failures and widespread hunger to wreak havoc across Europe. With no way of knowing if the current winter would be mild or deadly, medieval people had no choice but to prepare for the worst, always hoping for the best, but never truly certain of what lay ahead. Even the wealthiest individuals, who had access to food supplies, warm clothing, and sturdy homes, were not exempt from the ravages of the medieval winter. Castles, grand as they were, remained cold and damp, no matter how many fires were built. The rich may have been able to stockpile food and remain inside during the worst of the cold, but they were still subject to the same risks of disease and isolation. The common folk, living in more modest homes, had even less protection. The simple act of gathering firewood could become a struggle for survival. As the roads became clogged with snow and people scrambled to secure enough fuel to get through the long nights, families huddled together in tiny, overcrowded homes with little room to spare and no way of escaping the cold. It was a season that tested everyone's resolve, whether you lived in a grand stone castle or a humble hut. Winter was a force that could break you. For the peasants, there was always the underlying fear that they might not survive the season. They had to rely on their resourcefulness and the strength of their community to get through it. The winter months, with their darkness, cold, and danger, were a time when survival was never guaranteed. For the wealthier classes, it was a time of discomfort, isolation, and a constant battle against the elements. The medieval winter didn't care about status, wealth, or power. It was a leveler, forcing all people to reckon with the unrelenting power of nature. No one was safe from its fury. For medieval people, winter was a trial, a test of their ability to endure, to survive, and to come out the other side alive. And it was that trial that shaped so much of the culture, the folklore, and the very survival of medieval Europe. Asterisk. As we dive even deeper into the harsh realities of medieval winters, let's now focus on how the cold dramatically impacted the dynamics of warfare during this season. You might think that medieval battles were mostly fought during the warmer months when the terrain was passable and supplies were plentiful, but winter warfare was a whole different beast. The frozen landscape created challenges that warriors had to overcome, often testing their endurance and adaptability. War did not stop in the winter, far from it. In fact, some of the most brutal campaigns were fought during the coldest months, when soldiers had to contend not only with their enemies, but also with the biting cold and frozen terrain. The armies of the medieval period didn't have the luxury of modern technology or heated clothing. They fought in the same conditions as everyone else, but their survival depended on their ability to endure the frost and the snow. While castles were often cold and uncomfortable, medieval soldiers didn't even have the comfort of thick stone walls to protect them from the elements. They fought in open fields, on icy roads, and in snow-covered forests. These environments added a new layer of danger to battle strategies. And it wasn't just about combat anymore, it was about who could survive the cold long enough to win. In some cases, the bitter cold even influenced the course of battles. During winter, many armies would struggle to maintain their supply lines. The cold would freeze rivers and lakes, making them impossible to cross, and roads would become treacherous, slowing down the movement of troops and supplies. Sometimes, armies would have to huddle together in fortified camps, trying to survive the winter before resuming battle in the spring. However, this wasn't always possible, and winter battles could be unforgiving. Troops would have to wear layers of clothing to keep warm, but these garments were often ineffective against the severe temperatures. Soldiers might have fought with numb fingers, making it harder to hold their weapons or even manage basic tasks. When the wind would howl across the battlefield, it could freeze exposed skin within minutes, leaving soldiers vulnerable to frostbite. In the middle of these wars, some soldiers would not only face the enemy, but also the risk of losing their limbs to the frost. It wasn't just about the physical threat of battle, it was about staying alive long enough to fight. But as much as winter presented a challenge for the soldiers, it was equally as harsh for civilians caught in the path of war. When armies marched through villages, towns, or rural areas, they would often take whatever they could find: food, firewood, livestock, and anything else necessary to keep them going. For the peasants, this meant that their already scarce resources were depleted even further. Towns would be looted, and people left behind would be left without food and shelter. The armies didn't just need to survive the winter, they needed to keep moving, which meant burning through supplies at an alarming rate. For the civilians living in these areas, a passing army could mean the difference between life and death. They had to contend not only with the ravages of the cold, but with the reality of having everything they owned taken from them. This brutality added an extra layer of danger to an already perilous existence, even as soldiers fought to win territory. The people who lived in these lands were left to fend for themselves in the coldest and darkest months of the year. There was no safety, no reprieve. Everything was at risk. In some areas, war itself was influenced by the sheer cold of the season. As rivers froze, certain passes and trade routes that were typically used for military supply lines became impossible to navigate. What could have been a strategic advantage in the warmer months turned into a frustrating deadlock when faced with the frozen ground, and for armies already struggling with food supplies, the winter months made it even harder to get the resources they needed. This in turn could affect the outcome of campaigns. While soldiers could retreat into their fortresses or camps for warmth, they still faced the harsh realities of the winter: lack of food, frostbitten limbs, and frozen supplies often led to the collapse of even the most well-organized military efforts. The idea of winter soldiers wasn't just a poetic turn of phrase, it was a harsh reality. The bravest soldiers weren't just those who wielded the most deadly weapons, they were the ones who survived the cold long enough to take part in the battle. One notable effect of winter in warfare during the medieval period was the use of cold to their advantage in sieges. Medieval castles, though cold inside, were built to withstand siege tactics like battering rams and siege towers. But in the winter, some of the natural elements such as frozen rivers and icy roads could aid besieging forces. When a river froze, armies could use the ice to bring in supplies and troops from previously inaccessible areas. On the other hand, winter could make sieges harder for defenders. When a castle or fortified position was under siege, it was much more difficult for the defenders to stay warm in their cold stone buildings, leading to morale problems. The food supplies would dwindle, and if the cold persisted, even the mightiest fortress could be weakened. Soldiers in the field could lose their energy and endurance from the biting cold, and even the toughest men could be worn down by days or weeks of exposure. As a result, the outcome of many medieval sieges depended not only on the tactics used but also on the ability to survive the extreme cold. Winter also had a significant impact on the outcome of medieval campaigns. Some leaders, realizing the dangers of waging war in the winter, would use the season to rest their troops and regroup. The colder months were often used to strategize for the coming spring, a time when battle could resume in earnest. Campaigns that began in the spring or summer were often paused or slowed down as the first signs of winter set in. These pauses in military action provided an opportunity for the soldiers to rest and recover, but they also led to a period of tension. Soldiers would have to find shelter and firewood, ensuring they could survive the cold until they could continue their efforts. These seasonal breaks also gave the enemy time to regroup, often leading to prolonged campaigns that lasted years. Some wars, in fact, were more about surviving through the winter than achieving any immediate military goals. Warfare in the medieval period wasn't just about weapons, it was about endurance. As much as military tactics mattered, it was often the ability to endure the hardships of winter that would determine which side came out victorious in the end. The brutal medieval winters shaped not only the way people fought, but also the course of history. From castle sieges to the freezing roads, from the impact of the cold on soldiers' health to the dangers of starvation. Winter was not just a season, it was a force that could make or break entire campaigns. Even the wealthiest armies had to contend with the challenges of the season, and as we see from history, the worst winters were often the ones that decided the fates of kingdoms and empires. So, the next time you think about medieval battles, remember that it wasn't just the sword that determined the outcome, it was the brutal cold and the soldiers' ability to survive it. In many ways, the medieval winter was as much a part of the battle as the armies themselves. Asterisk. As we continue our journey through the brutal winters of the medieval world, it's time to explore one of the most terrifying and life-threatening dangers of the cold season, the threat of the plague. The winter months weren't just about enduring the cold, starvation, or isolation. They also provided the perfect environment for the spread of deadly diseases, with the most infamous being the Black Death. The combination of overcrowded living spaces, weakened immune systems, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge made medieval societies highly susceptible to disease outbreaks. Historians still debate how the cold weather directly contributed to the spread of the plague, but it's clear that winters, with their confinement and isolation, helped propagate the virus. People living in cramped conditions, often with limited access to clean water or proper hygiene, were more vulnerable to illnesses that could decimate entire populations. As winter set in, with its long, dark nights and freezing temperatures, people had little choice but to remain inside their homes for protection from the cold. But this confinement meant to shield people from the elements was ironically a double-edged sword, trapping them in a hotbed of disease and germs. Once a single person contracted the plague, it could quickly spread through a household, a village, or even an entire city. The cold winter months made it more difficult for those who fell ill to recover, and the sick were more vulnerable to the diseases that circulated in close quarters. The lack of sunlight weakened people's immune systems, and the stress of constantly battling the freezing temperatures and hunger left them more susceptible to infection. Disease spread rapidly in tight-knit communities, where families often shared living spaces with animals. The poor sanitation and lack of proper health care made it nearly impossible to control the spread of disease. When the plague entered a village, it didn't take long for it to spread like wildfire. And with no modern medicine to combat it, there was little hope for survival. The medical remedies that people relied on were largely ineffective, with doctors often resorting to leeches, bloodletting, or other crude methods that did more harm than good. The plague was particularly deadly during the winter months, as the cold made it difficult for people to escape or flee to safety. When an outbreak occurred, the best that people could hope for was to huddle together in an effort to stay warm. But the crowded conditions only served to accelerate the spread of the disease. The psychological toll of this constant threat of illness was immense. Medieval people lived with the daily fear that the plague could strike at any moment. During the coldest months of the year, when food supplies were running low and people were forced to stay indoors, the plague was an ever-present spectre. The fear of contracting the disease or watching loved ones fall ill became a part of everyday life. The long, dark nights only heightened this sense of dread as people struggled to make it through each day, hoping that the plague would not reach them. As entire families were wiped out by the disease, communities were left in ruins, and the social fabric of medieval society was torn apart. The psychological trauma of living through such times left lasting scars on the survivors, who carried with them the memory of the suffering they endured. For many, the winter months were not just a time of physical hardship, but also a time of mental anguish. As the ever-present threat of death loomed over them, the winter months were also a time when medieval people turned to superstitions and folklore to try and protect themselves from the diseases that ravaged their communities. In the face of an enemy they couldn't see or understand, people often resorted to charms, potions, and prayers, hoping to ward off the plague and other illnesses. While these beliefs were rooted in a lack of understanding of the true causes of disease, they provided some measure of comfort and control in a world that was often unpredictable and terrifying. People would hang amulets around their necks, burn incense, or perform rituals to protect themselves and their families from the invisible threats that lurked in the cold winter air. In some cases, entire villages would gather together to pray for protection from the plague, hoping that their collective efforts would be enough to ward off the disease. These rituals were a way of coping with the fear and uncertainty of the winter months, offering people a sense of agency in a time when they had little control over their own lives. In the wake of the plague, entire villages would be left desolate, with little more than abandoned homes and empty streets. The disease took such a heavy toll on the population that entire towns were wiped out, and it would take years, if not decades, for these communities to recover. The social and economic impact of the plague was devastating, as it disrupted trade, destroyed families, and left vast swaths of the population struggling to rebuild. Even after the immediate threat of the plague had passed, its legacy remained. Medieval people lived with the fear of future outbreaks and the memory of the devastation caused by the plague-haunted generations, the cold winters that followed. These outbreaks only added to the sense of isolation and despair, as communities struggled to recover from the damage done by both the disease and the harsh winter conditions. But not all the stories of survival in the medieval winters are bleak. Despite the challenges, people found ways to adapt and persevere. The resilience of medieval communities in the face of such overwhelming adversity is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. When faced with hunger, disease, and the unforgiving cold, people worked together to survive. They developed new methods of food preservation, built stronger homes to protect against the cold, and created systems of mutual aid to help each other through the toughest times. The hardships of the medieval winters forced people to innovate and find creative solutions to the challenges they faced. They learned how to store food in ways that would last through the winter, how to make clothing from animal skins to keep warm, and how to build shelters that could withstand the cold. These innovations helped people survive the winter months, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. The winter months may have been a time of immense hardship for medieval people, but they were also a time when communities came together and demonstrated remarkable resilience. In the face of disease, famine, and cold, people found ways to survive and rebuild. The stories of survival during the medieval winters are not just stories of hardship, they are stories of hope, of human ingenuity, and of the strength to endure even the harshest of seasons. As we reflect on these winters, we are reminded of the incredible resilience of those who lived through them and of the enduring human spirit that allowed them to face the darkness of winter with courage and determination. It was the will to survive that carried medieval communities through their darkest days, and it is that same will to survive that continues to inspire us today. Asterisk. As we continue our exploration of the cold, bleak winters that defined the medieval period, let's turn our attention to the fascinating folklore and superstitions that arose as a means of coping with the terrifying reality of the cold season. In the absence of scientific understanding, the medieval mind often turned to myths and stories to explain the dangers that winter brought. These tales weren't just for entertainment, they were woven into the fabric of daily life, offering people both comfort and a sense of control over the uncontrollable. During the darkest months, as the cold and snow isolated communities and made survival even more difficult, people turned to rituals, omens, and beliefs to protect themselves from the natural forces they could not see or understand. Some of these superstitions were rooted in ancient traditions, passed down through generations, while others emerged in response to the unique dangers of medieval winters, particularly the cold, disease, and the fear of death. In the gloom of long winter nights, people believed that spirits and supernatural beings walked among them, bringing either protection or peril. This belief in the supernatural was not just a way to explain the unexplainable. Light was a tool for survival, offering a psychological buffer against the harshness of that environment. One of the most pervasive themes in medieval winter folklore was the belief in winter spirits and creatures, many of which were tied to the colder months and the forces of nature. In Scandinavia, for example, there were stories of the Yule lads, mischievous creatures who visited homes during the winter season. These spirits would often play tricks on people or steal food, but they were also thought to bring good fortune to those who were kind and generous. The Yule lads were a blend of joy and mischief, embodying the unpredictability of winter itself, sometimes harsh, sometimes kind, but always present. Similarly, in other parts of Europe, there were stories of ghosts and spirits that were thought to roam during the long, dark nights. These spirits were believed to be the souls of the dead who were trapped in the world of the living during the winter months, unable to rest until the warmth of spring arrived. People believed that if they encountered one of these spirits, they might be cursed, and that rituals and offerings needed to be made to appease them. Some would leave food out, while others would recite prayers to ward off the evil spirits they feared might invade their homes. The winter solstice, a time of the longest night and shortest day, was especially potent in medieval superstition. People celebrated the return of the sun, marking the solstice as a turning point when the days would begin to lengthen and the cold would eventually recede. This moment was filled with rituals meant to ensure a good harvest, good health, and protection from evil. Bonfires were lit, and the warmth of the flames symbolized the return of the sun's light. These rituals, deeply ingrained in medieval culture, were a way for people to reclaim some control over their lives during the winter, a season that often felt beyond their reach. The darkest days of winter were a time when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds were believed to be thin, making it a time of heightened spiritual activity. People turned to these beliefs not only for protection but for hope, as the rituals and prayers offered a sense of connection to something greater than themselves. Of course, these beliefs and rituals weren't just about protecting against spirits, they were also about avoiding the very real dangers of winter, including death from the cold and the threat of disease. In some cases, medieval people believed that certain practices could prevent illness or even cure the sick. For example, one common superstition was that wearing certain charms, like a cross or a special pendant, could protect a person from the plague, which often reared its head during the winter months. In a time of disease outbreaks, such as the Black Death, these superstitions offered a psychological shield against the devastating consequences of illness. Though we now know that disease was spread by bacteria and not by supernatural forces, these beliefs were crucial in helping people maintain their mental health and cope with the overwhelming fear of death. In some rural areas, folk medicine mixed with these superstitions, with people using herbs and potions believed to have healing powers against colds and other ailments. Some of these herbal remedies, such as garlic, were used for their antibacterial properties, though the medieval people had no way of understanding the science behind them. Nonetheless, these practices were part of a broader system of belief that helped people navigate the terrifying uncertainties of winter. Another important aspect of medieval winter folklore was the role of winter festivals. These festivals were a time to come together, to celebrate the survival of another year, and to ward off the worst effects of winter. One of the most famous of these was, of course, Christmas, a religious festival celebrating the birth of Christ. But the medieval Christmas wasn't just about solemn reflection, it was a boisterous, community-driven event. The people of medieval Europe would gather to feast, drink, and exchange gifts, marking a temporary reprieve from the harsh realities of their daily lives. But beyond Christmas, other winter festivals were held to honor the gods, spirits, and ancestors that the people believed influenced their fate during the cold months. These celebrations were more than just parties, they were acts of defiance against the darkness and cold. An assertion that, no matter how difficult the season, the human spirit could endure. People celebrated in the hopes that the new year would bring better fortune and a milder winter. But even if it didn't, these festivals gave them something to look forward to, a reason to break the monotony of dark, cold days. In some parts of Europe, particularly in the Slavic regions, the winter solstice was marked by the celebration of a spirit known as Morako, a winter god associated with cold and frost. Morako was believed to be the personification of winter itself, a fearsome figure who could freeze anyone who crossed his path. Yet, he was also a figure of protections. Some stories tell of how Morocco would spare those who were kind and pure-hearted, while others believed that if you honored him with the right offerings, he would provide warmth and protection from the cold. This duality of winter, as both a cruel and protective force, was a recurring theme in many cultures, highlighting how people balanced their fear of the harsh season with the hope of surviving it. The superstitions surrounding Morocco and similar figures were a way of engaging with the season, of attempting to control the uncontrollable and making sense of the natural forces that determined their lives. Even as medieval winters were marked by their overwhelming hardships, there were also a time when people engaged deeply with their environment, turning their fears into stories, their rituals into acts of defiance, and their superstitions into strategies for survival. The mythology, the folklore, and the magic of winter were a way for people to reclaim power during a season that often felt like an overwhelming force. And while these beliefs and customs may seem odd or outdated to us today, they were incredibly important in helping people face the brutal reality of medieval winters. By looking to these myths, spirits, and rituals, people were able to navigate the darkness, not just physically but psychologically, and emerge, after months of cold and hardship, into the light of spring. These traditions were as much about survival as they were about hope that the season would end, hope that the sun would return, and hope that, somehow, they would make it through another winter. Asterisk, asterisk. As we continue to delve deeper into the frostbitten world of medieval winters, let's turn our attention to the long-lasting effects the cold had on society, particularly in shaping its economy and culture. It's hard to imagine how a season, one that seemingly only lasts for a few months, could have such a profound impact on an entire way of life. But medieval winters were so severe that they could disrupt almost every aspect of daily living. Winter in the medieval period was a time of scarcity, and those months spent fighting against the cold, battling hunger, and keeping disease at bay affected not only the people of the time, but also the economy that supported them. The cold weather brought with it widespread crop failures, hampering food production and making it difficult for people to sustain themselves. Once winter took hold, farming essentially stopped. The ground froze, preventing any further planting or harvesting, which meant that medieval peasants had to rely on the food they had stored from previous harvests to survive the months ahead. If there was a bad harvest or a shortage of stored food, it could lead to devastating consequences. This struggle to ensure a steady food supply was a constant concern for medieval communities, where the ability to grow enough food to last through the winter was critical. Famine was never far from the minds of medieval people, and a particularly harsh winter could be the difference between survival and death. With the weather preventing trade and travel, it was difficult to bring in supplies from other regions, making food even scarcer. The result was a tight, tense economy, where the risk of starvation loomed large, and even small disruptions could have catastrophic effects on society as a whole. Agriculture, the backbone of the medieval economy, was directly affected by the cold. Winters brought about a seasonal halt to farming activity. The ground would freeze, and even the hardiest of crops could not survive the freeze. Grain production, essential for bread, the staple food of the time, was particularly vulnerable. The lack of food during the colder months created a vicious cycle. The cold made it impossible to produce food, while the scarcity of food made it harder to survive the cold. In the most extreme cases, food prices soared, and the poor would find themselves unable to afford even the most basic necessities. Famine, which followed harsh winters, often decimated whole communities, causing social upheaval and widespread suffering. The worst of these famine years were particularly harsh, such as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which lasted for 2 years and killed millions of people across Europe. It wasn't just the poor who suffered from hunger. Entire regions could collapse as the middle class and aristocracy, too, found themselves grappling with insufficient resources to carry them through the winter. In addition to the direct impact on food production, medieval winters also strained the economy through the collapse of trade routes. During the winter, rivers, seas, and roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Transporting goods became a matter of life or death, as freezing temperatures and treacherous roads made it nearly impossible to travel. This had a particularly devastating impact on the trade of goods such as grain, meat, and other essential supplies. People living in isolated villages, far from trade routes, often found themselves trapped, cut off from the rest of the world, struggling to survive. And for those who could still trade, they faced the problem of rising costs. The scarcity of goods in the winter months drove up prices, making the economy even more unstable. In many cases, the harsh winter and its effects on trade caused long-term damage to the market. For centuries, these freezing winters would remain a significant factor in shaping the economy, contributing to the cycles of boom and bust that medieval Europe saw. The cold also played a key role in shaping the social and cultural practices of the medieval world. These long, cold winters brought people indoors, forcing them to huddle together in small, crowded homes for warmth and comfort. While this had obvious drawbacks, crowded, poorly ventilated homes often led to the spread of disease. It also fostered a sense of community. People would gather around the hearth for warmth, and families, neighbors, and friends would bond over meals, shared stories, and laughter. This communal living became a way of coping with the brutal cold. People would share whatever food they had, even if it was meager, and trade goods and services to get through the winter. The cold months created a need for mutual support that transcended class and status. It was during these months of hardship that communities would come together to provide help and support to those who were most vulnerable. Those who had access to more food would share with the less fortunate, while the strong would assist the weak. For medieval people, the cold season reinforced the importance of community, solidarity, and mutual aid. This sense of community was also reinforced by the festivals and religious observances that punctuated the winter months. Despite the hardship, people found moments of joy and celebration in their shared rituals. Christmas, the feast of St. Nicholas, and the winter solstice were just a few of the holidays that gave people a much-needed break from the cold and allowed them to celebrate the coming of the light. These festivals offered not only a chance to rest and relax, but also to reaffirm social bonds. People would gather in churches and town squares, singing carols, sharing food, and giving gifts to one another. The festivals were a reminder that, no matter how severe the winter, there were still moments of light and warmth to be found. Medieval winters also shaped the cultural practices and traditions that have lasted into the modern day. Many of the practices we associate with Christmas today, such as decorating trees, exchanging gifts, and enjoying large meals with loved ones, have roots in the winter traditions of medieval Europe. These customs emerged as people struggled to bring warmth and joy into their homes during the coldest months of the year. The traditions of feasting and celebrating with loved ones were ways of counteracting the isolation and hardship of winter, providing comfort and solace during a time of great difficulty. Over time, these practices evolved and became intertwined with Christian religious observances, giving rise to the holiday traditions we know today. Winter also had a profound impact on art and literature. During the medieval period, artists, poets, and storytellers often drew inspiration from the harsh seasons and the human experience of enduring the cold. The long winter nights provided a canvas for stories of adventure, survival, and heroism. Many medieval tales centered around the trials and tribulations of individuals facing the harsh winter, and these stories often included themes of perseverance, community, and the struggle to survive. Art too was influenced by the cold, with many works depicting the stark beauty of winter landscapes or scenes of people gathering around the hearth for warmth. These artistic representations of winter were a way for medieval people to process their experiences of the season, to reflect on the challenges they faced, and to find meaning in the harsh reality of their world. The medieval winters, with their cold, isolation, and scarcity, left an indelible mark on the society and culture of the time. From the economic strain to the cultural and social impacts, these harsh winters shaped the way people lived, worked, and related to one another. Despite the dangers and hardships, the resilience and resourcefulness of the medieval people allowed them to survive and adapt. The legacy of these winters can still be seen today in the customs, traditions, and stories that have been passed down through generations. The struggle to survive the medieval winter, with all its challenges and hardships, remains an enduring symbol of the human spirit's capacity to endure, adapt, and thrive. As we venture even deeper into the heart of medieval winters, it's impossible not to acknowledge the profound effects that this relentless season had on the course of history, and the way in which these brutal winters shaped the very fabric of medieval life. While many might assume that winter in medieval times was simply an unfortunate season, it was much more than that. It was a defining force, central to the rhythm of life, dictating the patterns of human behavior, survival strategies, and even political decisions. The cold, as unforgiving as it was, permeated every aspect of life. For the peasant farmers, their very livelihood depended on surviving the winter. The cold marked the end of the growing season, leaving them to rely on what they had harvested and preserved. For many, it was a race against time. Could they store enough food to last through the freezing months? Could they manage to keep their livestock alive despite the cold temperatures? These questions, pressing and constant, were the reality for most medieval folk. The freeze came with a deep sense of uncertainty, and every winter left people wondering whether they would be able to make it through until the thaw. The uncertainty of the season also shaped the medieval mindset. For the common folk, as well as the nobility, winter was a time of fear, a time where survival itself could be at risk, and the worst-case scenario was a real possibility. Yet, despite the dangers of the season, medieval winters were also a time of innovation. People had to be resourceful in order to adapt to the cold. In fact, many of the survival strategies people developed to cope with the freezing months, such as more efficient ways of preserving food, methods of insulation, and ways to gather and use firewood, became foundational to the way life was. structured during the colder months. These strategies weren't simply about staving off the cold for the present, they were about creating a way of life that could withstand the ongoing cycle of freezing winters. For example, the way people stored grain and meat was vital to survival. In a time without refrigeration, the preservation of food was a skill passed down through generations. Salting meat, drying fish, and using root cellars to store vegetables were just some of the ways people ensured they could eat throughout the winter months. They also relied on animals, cattle, pigs, and sheep for milk, meat, and wool. In the coldest months, it was a constant balancing act between managing the health of their animals and ensuring there was enough food for everyone. The survival of these practices from one year to the next depended on careful planning and foresight. The harsh winters had a hand in shaping the medieval economy by forcing people to be more frugal, careful, and inventive in their use of resources. As winter set in, medieval societies turned inward. The extended periods of darkness and cold created a need for closer-knit communities. The communal hearth became a symbol of warmth, safety, and connection during these long, dark nights. People who lived in small rural villages often relied on one another for survival, whether it was through helping to keep a fire burning, sharing food, or offering shelter. This sense of solidarity became essential during the cold months. It's hard to imagine, given the divide between classes in medieval society, but winter provided a common enemy that brought people together. Even the most rigid social structures could not protect individuals from the extreme cold. The wealthy may have had access to greater resources, but their survival also depended on the cooperation of their servants, laborers, and tradesmen. Thus, winter was a time when the boundaries between classes blurred, and communities depended on each other more than ever. But the winter months weren't just about physical survival. They were also about psychological endurance. In an age with no electricity or heating, the isolation that came with winter could be overwhelming. Long periods of darkness, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of hunger or illness could wear down even the most stoic individuals. The winter months often tested people's mental fortitude as much as their physical stamina. The constant fear of disease outbreaks, particularly the plague, could paralyze entire villages. With medieval medicine being so rudimentary, disease was as much a psychological threat as a physical one. When people weren't huddled around a fire, they were often locked in their homes, in darkness, with the knowledge that disease could come knocking at any moment. For many, this sense of helplessness, knowing that they were at the mercy of nature and disease, led to a kind of communal resignation. The cold was more than a physical trial, it was an emotional one too, and for the poor, who had fewer resources to protect themselves, the winter was especially brutal. It wasn't just the weather, it was the knowledge that you had little control over your life, and that any misstep could lead to death. Despite all of this, though, it was during these dark, isolated months that the most profound acts of kindness and cooperation took place. Medieval winters forged bonds that might not have existed during other seasons, and people often turned to religion and faith for solace, praying for warmth, safety, and the eventual return of the sun. Medieval winters also had a deep impact on the political and military landscape of the time. Many battles were fought with the season in mind, and winter campaigns could be particularly brutal. Armies, limited by the extreme cold, had to adapt their strategies for survival as much as for victory. Some military leaders would use the winter months to regroup, build fortifications, or stage surprise attacks. Others took advantage of frozen rivers and lakes to to move their forces quickly and surprise their enemies. The challenge of keeping soldiers warm, fed, and healthy during the winter months was one of the greatest obstacles facing medieval armies. Supplies would often dwindle, and morale could plummet. Soldiers who were already exhausted from the strain of war now had to contend with the added burden of battling the elements. In some cases, armies would wait out the winter, hoping that the thaw would give them an advantage in the coming spring. However, battles also continued through the winter, with soldiers braving the cold and fighting in the snow. The most famous winter campaigns were those fought in the frozen fields of Eastern Europe and Russia, where the winters could be brutal enough to defeat even the most well-equipped forces. The defeat of Napoleon's army during the Russian winter of 1812 is just one example of how the cold weather played a decisive role in military history. The cold was also a powerful motivator for innovation. During the medieval period, people developed new methods of insulation for their homes. The design of medieval buildings, particularly those in the northern regions of Europe, was heavily influenced by the need to stay warm. Thick walls, small windows, and the use of thatched roofs were all designed with the cold in mind. People became experts in building shelters that could retain heat, and innovations in heating technology were driven by the necessity to survive the winter. The cold forced people to think creatively and use the materials they had on hand in new ways. Similarly, medieval people developed ways of preserving food that would last through the winter. Salting and drying were common methods of preserving meat, while root vegetables and grains were stored in cool, dry places to keep them from spoiling. These innovations in food preservation were essential to survival during the harsh winter months, and they were passed down through generations. In conclusion, the brutal winters of medieval Europe were not just a seasonal challenge, they were a defining force that shaped society, economy, and culture in profound ways. The cold, while a constant threat, also brought people together, sparking innovation, fostering community, and driving survival strategies. From the physical endurance required to face the elements to the psychological resilience needed to cope with isolation, disease, and uncertainty, medieval winters left a lasting imprint on the people who lived through them. Whether through the stories and rituals that helped people cope, the survival strategies that kept communities intact, or the military campaigns that were fought against the backdrop of freezing cold, the legacy of these winters continues to be felt. The medieval winter was more than just a season, it was a trial by fire, testing every aspect of medieval life and leaving a lasting mark on history. Now, as we arrive at the final stretch of our journey through the chilling world of medieval winters, it's important to reflect on the legacy these bitter seasons left behind. The brutal winters weren't just a memory for medieval people, they became the backbone of stories, myths, and lessons that would reverberate through generations. As hard as they were, these winters pushed humanity to its limits, demanding innovation, resourcefulness, and resilience. The harshness of the cold led to some of the most profound changes in medieval society, forcing people to develop new strategies for survival, new ways of thinking, and new ways of connecting with each other. These challenges gave rise to cultural practices, social norms, and even technological innovations that would shape future generations. From the design of homes to the preservation of food, the medieval winter was a crucible where the survival instinct was honed to its sharpest edge. In a sense, the medieval winter was the ultimate test, one that would weed out the weak and forge stronger communities, driven by the will to endure and adapt. Perhaps one of the most striking things about these winters was their ability to unite communities. While the rich and the poor were often divided by class and privilege, the dangers of winter did not discriminate. The cold was a common enemy, one that made no exceptions for nobility or serfdom. For peasants, the harsh winter meant that survival depended on the cooperation of the entire village, and people would often pool their resources to make it through the coldest months. They shared what little food they had, helped one another gather firewood, and protected each other from the deadly effects of isolation and hunger. For the aristocracy, the cold was a reminder that wealth couldn't shield them from nature's power. Though they had better access to food, warmer homes, and more substantial clothing, they still had to endure the same challenges as everyone else, and often had to rely on the labor of the peasants to survive. This shared struggle for survival became a profound equalizer, and despite the divisions of medieval society, the threat of winter forged a sense of collective responsibility. The political and military ramifications of the medieval winter also left a deep mark on history. The inability of armies to fight or maneuver effectively during the winter months meant that wars would often pause, only to resume with renewed vigor in the spring. But in some cases, the winter months proved to be crucial in determining the outcomes of battles. The notorious Russian winter during Napoleon's invasion in 1812 serves as one of the most famous examples in history. Armies, even those as powerful as Napoleon's, were no match for the cold, and many soldiers were wiped out by frostbite and disease before they ever faced the enemy. For medieval leaders, the winter months were often a time to fortify their defenses, regroup, and wait for the weather to improve before advancing. During sieges, the cold would take a toll on both the attackers and defenders, as soldiers were forced to huddle in freezing conditions, often without enough provisions to sustain them. Medieval military leaders knew that battles could not be won simply with swords and strategy. They had to plan for the elements, too. The weather could be as much an enemy as any army, and understanding how to survive the winter could be the key to victory. But the winter didn't just define medieval warfare, it also shaped the cultural and social landscape. As we've already seen, winter festivals played a critical role in alleviating the stress and monotony of the season. The deep cold and darkness of the winter months could lead to a sense of isolation and despair, but winter festivals in both religious and folk traditions offered people a chance to break free from the hardships of daily life. These festivals, which included feasting, singing, dancing, and offering sacrifices to spirits, helped to reinforce the social bonds between people. In a time when survival was often uncertain, these festivals were vital for maintaining morale. They provided a moment of escape, a brief reprieve from the endless struggle of the cold months. In many ways, the festivals became a way for medieval communities to defy the cold, showing that despite the harshness of the season, they could still come together, celebrate, and reaffirm their humanity. Religious observances also took on heightened significance during the winter. Christianity, which was central to medieval life, offered people a sense of comfort and solace during the darkest days of winter. Christmas, marking the birth of Christ, was a time of great joy and celebration, but it also symbolized the triumph of light over darkness, a theme that resonated deeply during the long, gloomy nights of winter. The birth of Christ was not just a religious event, it was a reminder that even in the bleakest times, there was hope. This symbolism was a powerful force in medieval communities, helping people endure the winter with a sense of faith that spring and the return of the sun would eventually come. Despite all the hardship, medieval winters also gave rise to profound artistic and cultural expressions. The long nights spent indoors provided the perfect opportunity for storytelling, and the cold and darkness became the backdrop for some of the most enduring legends and myths of European folklore. Tales of ghosts, spirits, and mythical creatures, like the Yule lads in Scandinavian countries, emerged as people sought to explain the mysteries of winter. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were ways for people to make sense of the dangers that surrounded them. Stories of ghosts roaming the earth, spirits guarding against evil, or deities associated with the cold, such as Morocco and Slavic folklore, helped to give structure to the fears and uncertainties of the season. These myths provided comfort, allowing people to feel as though they could confront the darkness together, united by their shared belief in the supernatural. Additionally, winter itself became a popular subject for art. The stark landscapes of snow-covered fields, forests, and frozen rivers captured the imagination of medieval artists. Paintings, tapestries, and sculptures often depicted scenes of daily life in winter, from peasants huddling by the fire to grand castles set against the backdrop of winter storms. These works of art were not merely decorative, they were ways for medieval people to reflect on the hardships they faced and the beauty they could still find in a season that was so often cruel. These images of winter, full of cold beauty and struggle, have endured for centuries, serving as a testament to the resilience and creativity of medieval society. As we reach the end of our exploration of medieval winters, it's clear that these seasons were much more than just a time of cold and hardship. They were a defining force in medieval life, shaping everything from the economy to culture, from politics to art. The trials of surviving the brutal cold forged a society that was resilient, inventive, and deeply connected to one another. The legacy of these winters can still be felt today in the customs, stories, and traditions passed down through generations. While the medieval winters were certainly brutal, they also provided the backdrop for some of the most enduring human quality: strength, solidarity, faith, and creativity. And in that harsh cold, people learned to endure, adapt, and thrive. Asterisk.